Many people assume that building wealth is mainly about income, that if you don't earn much, there simply isn't much you can do. But that assumption doesn't really hold up. What often gets overlooked is that wealth isn't built through intensity or motivation, but through consistency, and consistency depends on structure. If income were the deciding factor, the real question wouldn't change much. But when income isn't the deciding factor, the question shifts. It moves from how can I earn more to what am I not seeing yet? Because the difference is rarely effort, it's clarity. There are quiet counterexamples that challenge the income narrative. One of them is Sylvia Bloom. She worked as a legal secretary for most of her life. No extraordinary salary, no public success story. And yet, after her death, it became known that she had accumulated several $1,000,000 simply by investing consistently over decades and living below her means. This story isn't meant to promise a specific outcome. It's meant to make one thing visible. Income sets the pace. Structure decides whether repetition is possible at all. People like Sylvia Bloom didn't rely on motivation. They didn't optimize constantly. They had a financial life that allowed the same decision to be repeated month after month. Structure, in this context, doesn't mean restriction. It means predictability. It means that money doesn't move randomly through your life. That income, costs, and decisions are aligned well enough that doing the same thing every month is actually possible. Monthly investing, for example, isn't a mindset. It's a consequence of having a setup that can support repetition without stress. This is why the order matters. First comes analysis, not change, not improvement. You start by making your financial reality visible. How much money reliably comes in, how much of it is already committed to fixed costs, and what actually remains. At this stage, nothing needs to be optimized. Nothing needs to be cut. The goal is simply to stop guessing. In both finance and behavioral economics, long-term consistency depends on understanding cash flow first. Once that overview exists, patterns begin to appear, often not in big, dramatic expenses, but in small, repeated ones. Coffee on the go, eating out, ordering food, subscriptions that quietly renew every month. Individually, these expenses barely register. Over time, they add up. For many people, the real shift happens when they take one of these costs and do something very simple with it. They add it up for a month, and then they multiply it by 12. That's often the moment things change. Not because the number is bad, but because it's real. The question stops being, can I afford this? And becomes, is this as important to me as I thought over a year? This isn't about guilt. For some people, the answer is yes, and that's fine. For others, that moment creates room that didn't exist before, not because income changed, but because visibility did. This is where intentional limits start to make sense. Not bans, not rules, but small, conscious budgets for recurring expenses, a way of deciding once instead of renegotiating the same choice every single day. The same logic applies to subscriptions. Some add real value. Others continue simply because they're invisible. Removing one or two that don't matter much often creates more space than expected, without affecting quality of life. Once those patterns are understood, it becomes possible to look at something more structural. Fixed cost. Not with the expectation that everything can or should change, but because fixed costs multiply automatically over time. Housing, transportation, long-term commitments. These choices carry more weight than almost anything else in a monthly budget. In some situations, it can make sense to think about them, not to act immediately, but to ask whether the structure you're carrying still fits the reality of your income today. Even small structural adjustments here, sometimes temporary ones, can create breathing room that no amount of daily optimization ever could. At some point, intuition isn't enough anymore. This is where looking at your own data matters. Not 1 month, not a particularly good or bad period, but several months, long enough to see what is consistent, what fluctuates, and what quietly shapes your financial reality over time. This step turns assumptions into facts. It shows whether your budgets are realistic, whether your fixed costs leave enough room, and whether the structure you're building can actually repeat itself. Only after all of this does it make sense to think about saving or investing. Because the only number that matters then is simple: how much you can set aside reliably without stress, without constant adjustment, without breaking the system. Repetition builds wealth, and repetition only survives when the structure supports it. So if you do one thing after this, write your numbers down: your income, your fixed costs, your recurring spending, and what's left. Nothing more, nothing less. That's where structure begins.